Alright, in this video I'm going to be going over environmental settings within AV and camera settings and scene settings, which the lighting team will be controlling. So if I go up here to render properties, which looks like a little camera, or the backside of a little camera, not the one that's underneath that looks like a printed image, you can see that you have settings for the current rendering engine, and you can change the sampling in everything. If you set the sampling to 0, it'll continuously improve, as you can see there. However, usually it's best to set it to some limited number, just so you increase performance within the viewport. And you can see there that when you rotate the viewport for performance, it only renders out a single sample of the scene, of the lighting rather. Viewport denoising, you won't need this very much, but it's usually good just to keep it checked on. So I'm just gonna go from the start and go down. So ambient occlusion. This ambient occlusion creates ambient occlusion within the occluded areas of the model. So if I turn this on and off, you can see that within the shadows become deeper where everything is occluded. This is more realistic, and it's usually only used in game engines as when you automatically get this for free when you're ray tracing. I can't speak. You can also go in here and you can change the distance of them, the trace precision of them, don't worry about that too much, and the factor of them, so how dark they are. Also, bounce approximation you usually want to keep on, and bent normals you usually want to keep on. So the presets, essentially. If you want me to show you it without the light here, you can see the ambient occlusion is darkening the areas around the model. This looks a little bit weird just because of the way it renders. However, most people don't notice this sort of fading effect around the edges. If we have problems with it, I'll be happy to talk to you and go through the different workflows and ways that we can avoid it or get around these problems. Anyway, let me undo that, and I'll just keep ambient occlusion on. If you turn on bloom, this doesn't seem to do very much initially. However, wherever there's a strong light or a strong reflection, it'll create a slight bloom around that object. With this, it's usually better to turn the threshold up and play around with the settings so that you don't get very, very obvious bloom. If I can bring in a UV sphere, just a sphere, you can see the bloom on this object and how that's happening right there. If I had an object that is emissive, this bloom also shows up on that emissive object. So you can have yeah, I'm sure you've seen the super sci-fi looking stuff where it's just emissive, that's the word, materials with a high bloom. So if I go in here, let me quickly add a material. I'll go into this in a little bit, and I can increase the emission. I cannot see now. So if I increase the emission here, change the color, and it should have worked, but for whatever reason, oh, I'm sorry, I applied it to this sphere. This sphere, yeah, should show a little bit of bloom now, but because I changed the settings, it doesn't. Anyway, that's just a setting. Try to play around with it. Going back to sampling, so under bloom, we have depth of field. This depth of field is depth of field to camera. Max size, it's actually determined by the camera and the depth of field of the camera. So max size just determines the how blurry it can become. If you want, I believe I can very quickly bring it up within this. Go in here, go into camera settings, depth of field, focus on an object. Let me focus on the cube. And now if I go in here and I bring the cube closer to the camera, you can see that the background, because I'm focusing in on the cube, the background becomes blurry. These are settings that are within the camera, this object data properties, which looks like a green version of whatever you're clicking, and under depth of field. Don't really worry about these settings. A lot of these, well, I mean, you may have to worry about these settings now, but I'll have a separate video when that time comes. Anyway, going back to rendering settings, this max size determines how blurry it is. Subsurface scattering. These are sampling rates for if you have an object that has subsurface scattering like skin. Screen space reflections. These are reflections that are based on the viewport. So when I turn these on, you'll see a very slight difference in reflection of light coming from the plane to the object and the object to the plane. So if I click on that, there you go. You can see that there's a very, very slight reflection down here. It all depends on the materials of the objects. So if I go in here, let me add a new material, and let me decrease the roughness of this, you can now see that the reflections are showing up a little bit better. If I change the base color, they'll show up a little bit better, just because of contrast and all that sort of stuff. You can see that lights are reflected within reflections directly. However, you can change that in a setting. Anyway, I'll just keep with this material while we go on. So screen space reflections, currently they're at half res trace, so you can see this object has a fuzzy surrounding, even though this reflection is supposed to be completely clear. If I turn off half res trace, you can see it gets a little bit better. Now, these reflections are not physically accurate. This means that, I mean, they're cheating, basically. So it basically only takes the depth of the scene and reflects objects onto the surface by reversing the depth and reversing the materials in a little funky process. That's what screen space means. These reflections are only in the screen and not really rendered out. If I was to change this to cycles, you can now see that these reflections are perfect and they are properly done. However, cycles is a ray tracing engine, and so doing this for everything kind of becomes a pain, especially with rendering times going up to the hours per frame. Anyway, going back to Eevee, we're just going to mess around with settings. So just to switch in between the two, you can see that there's a slight difference in the location of the shadow, the sharpness, and all that sort of stuff. Cycles is more accurate, however, Eevee is real time. Anyway, refraction, you only have to worry about this with glass-like materials. Anyway, so trace precision, you can increase and decrease this, and you can kind of see what this does. It just increases and decreases the trace precision. Higher values, of course, decrease the speed of the viewport. So at times it's better to have a really low trace precision, and then when we're rendering, raise it up. You can also change the max roughness. You'll see this. It has to do with the variation of roughness across the surface and how much it reflects. So currently, if the roughness of a material is at 0.5, it doesn't reflect anything. It's a cutoff. So thickness, this has to do with thickness is kind of an annoying thing. When you see it, it'll make sense. However, when you see it and hear it, it doesn't seem to change anything. Anyway, edge fading, so you can see whether or not this edge fading is based on the screen space. So if I go out here, and you can see that the reflection here is fading. So edge fading determines how much the edge fades. And then clamp. Clamp is, I believe, a setting associated with edge fade. Though I might be incorrect. I have to apologize. Anyway, motion blur. This does what it says. If I have an object that is going from one area, location, and it's going to another area extremely quickly, we'll have motion blur. Let's see. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. My default keyframes are not your default keyframes because I set up something for animation. Let me go in here and let me fix the keyframes by going through the graph editor and let's see, it was T. Yes, it was T. Bezier, and so now we can see. So now you can see the object being moved. And this motion blur, you're going to have to play with the settings because this object, even though it's moving fairly quickly, doesn't seem to have much motion blur on it. There should also be a setting that you can enable to see the motion blur within the viewport instead of just while it's playing. Because there is motion blur there, it's just... Anyway, volumetrics. We'll get into this a little bit more when we're dealing with volumetric shadows. Or not volumetric shadows, I mean like God rays and volumetric environments. Hair. If we do hair, we'll get into this. If not, don't worry about it. Shadows. This is probably the biggest thing that you're going to worry about for the time being. So if I bring this up, the shadows themselves, even if I have soft shadows turned on, are very grainy. So you can see that they're very pixelated. If I increase the cube size of the shadows to like 1080, you can see that they're slightly higher res. This is probably best seen if I create a very small light like this. So you can see that even though that it's soft shadowing and you can see it's dithering up here, you can see it's still low res. If I set it to 512, you can see it's low res. Raise it up, 2048, it's higher res, 4K, you can do that. But for most of the time, we're going to be working with 512 and 1024 as we're using soft shadows. And I'll find the setting for soft shadows in a moment, and we'll go over that. Anyway, cascade size. This is the light of, this is the resolution of sun-based shadows. So this can sometimes be better to increase the main shadow's resolution and then change the resolution of these, or of other lights. Light threshold, you can read what that does. Minimum light intensity for light to contribute to the lighting. So if it's at 0.01 of a watt, it won't show up at all. Anyway, indirect lighting. This has to do with reflections and cube maps and everything else. You don't have to worry about this for now. I'll go over that in a separate video. Film. So, under this film option, this filter size is width over... This has to do with sampling and stuff like that. You don't have to worry about this now. If I check transparent, the world itself will become transparent within the viewport. It'll show check marks in the viewport, and it will render out, and if you save in a compatible file, it will, or in a compatible video format, it will have these backgrounds completely clear. Anyway, overscan. So what this screen space reflections, as I said before, were based on basically a viewport trick of creating reflections. And this means if I zoom in, you can see now that this cube's reflection is not completely showing, and it's based off of the limit of the viewport here. So you can see as I lower my camera, the reflections get smaller and the top gets clipped off. If I was to add a little thing to this, you can see in the reflections it's showing. However, the bottom side of it is not reflecting because I don't see it within the viewport. And if I go down here, you can see it doesn't show up at all, though some of its shadow effects still appear. This overscan basically increases the screen space size to account for these reflections that we can't see. Currently, it only goes up to 10%. However, this should be a soft cap. Yep. So if I go up to 50%, it'll show it'll render out 50% more than what my viewport shows. So if I render out overscan 100%, is 50% the limit? Apparently 50% is the limit. But you can see how that, even though it's clipping up here, it's still showing some of this. So if I turn off overscan, some of that will go away. Overscan, it may not change, it doesn't change a lot of things in the viewport. This is mainly to do with rendering. So when you're in a camera and you're rendering in camera with Eevee, then this overscan option will be applied. Apologies for not making that clear. I got that mixed up with a different option. Now, anyway, I believe that's the most amount of them. Soft shadows here. This is the option that I wanted to show you. So if I turn off soft shadows or turn back on soft shadows, you can see, whoops, not high bit depth, you can see that it dithers like that. So soft shadows on versus off. What's currently creating this very sharp shadow is the fact that I have contact shadows turned on. And because of the scale of this being so small, it just sort of messes with a lot of the angles and stuff like that to do with small shadows. Normally, if you have a light this small, you want to have it as a point light instead of a area light, and that'll prevent things from messing up. So you can see right here that now it, like, even though when I move it still looks a little weird, it dithers in a mostly correct way. Once again, this is a real-time engine. This is not meant to be, completely crazy. Anyway, down here, in a different video, I'm going to go over how you can fix this issue with planar reflections and with round reflections, and the issues that we have with cube maps and reflection maps. Of course, this is all dependent on game engines, and specifically Eevee, because Eevee's reflection system and stuff like that is built for real time, while Cycles is built for accurate reflections. So you can see now the bottom is properly reflected. However, with Eevee, real time, baby, real time. Even if you get these weird errors, which can be fixed. Anyway,